All right, everyone. Well, this is a really special edition of an esoterical live stream. I have to say, I'm really stoked about the possibility here of getting to sit down with Eric Purdue, um, the translator, the most recent and I think the best translation of Agrippa's three books of occult philosophy. Um, Again, folks, these kinds of live streams and these kinds of interviews are only possible with your support through Patreon or donation. So I really just want to encourage you, if you can do that, please do that. But Eric, I just want to extend. Hey, man, I've read Agrippa my share of times. I've read him in Latin. I've worked through him, and I just want to say a deep and profound thanks to you for the work you've done to render Agrippa for a new generation and render Agrippa in a way that is rigorous and complete and really brings him to a new generation of scholars and practitioners. So, folks, I really want to welcome Eric Purdue, and I want to thank you so much for the work you've done in providing us new access to Agrippa's three books of occult philosophy.
Well, thanks for having me. You're going to make me blush here. So,
That's the point, man. Hey, when you do the work, you deserve the blush. Like, when you do this kind of work, I really appreciate it. So, folks, again, welcome so much to another Esoteric Live Stream with Eric Purdue on translating Agrippa's occult philosophy, which is a kind of a pain, right? Because you're not only translating Latin, but you're translating esoteric Latin. So it's
yeah.
doubly hard on so many levels. And so again, I just want to extend my deep appreciation for the work that you've done, so that people don't have to rely on this edition, which is my handy dandy 1600 Agrippa opera, which I'll be showing off a little bit as we get into the talk.
You're definitely showing off.
Hey, man, I hold these books with dear esteem. It's one thing to be able to flip through this. So we'll talk about the book a bit more in a little bit. But Eric, how'd you get interested in Agrippa? I mean, I know that we all of us folks are interested in occultism. We're going to cross paths with Agrippa, but how did you find Agrippa in your own practice and philosophical development?
Well, when I was in kindergarten, I'm just kidding. Uh, so I really had no ambition to do anything like this originally. I met my first metaphysical teacher by accident, and uh, I was looking for someone to teach me Golden Dawn ceremonial magic, and I met this one man by accident and series of accidents. So he turned out to be a priest in Afro-Cuban Lukumi Santeria.
Mhm.
I didn't know that. He didn't even tell me for a while. Um, so I fell into that by unwittingly, and but also he was well versed in Western esotericism. So probably this would have been in the mid '90s. I'm thinking he told me about Picatrix,
Mm-hmm.
and he wasn't aware of any critical editions or translations or any. I don't think there were any. Oh, there was the German translation, I guess, by then. He wasn't aware of that yet. Um, but he told me that for now we have Agrippa's three books of occult philosophy, which is equivalent to book two of Picatrix, which we now know is not true. But that's what I thought. And so we talked about Agrippa back then, quite a bit. And eventually he passed, and I started sort of going backwards, trying to sort of reconstruct all of these things that he had taught me and things I'd been interested in. And I found three books in an occult store, and I just bought it. And I'm like, oh, it's that guy. And I read it cover to cover, and I started getting very interested in the astrology in it. I didn't really know much about astrology yet, and started doing research. I discovered all these different branches of astrology. That was kind of a long story right there. And as I was digging into Agrippa, I realized that he was talking about a kind of astrology that I'd never heard of,
Mm.
using terminology that was very obscure. And through meeting Christopher Warnock,
Mm-hmm.
who's a well-known astrological magician for those who don't know, said, "Oh yeah, Tyson has a lot of bad notes about astrology,"
Yeah, yeah, we'll get to
and
that. We'll get to that in a
we'll
minute.
get to
Yeah,
that in a little bit.
yeah.
And that just sort of started me down a rabbit hole. But the first thing I wanted to do was translate Picatrix, and I did start that. I got about three quarters of the way through, and Christopher Warnock published his. I just gave it up. I didn't want to push it. I was struggling with the animal names and the incense ingredients and all that. It was kind of a mess. Um, Strangely enough, Agrippa seemed more approachable.
I would no, I would definitely say that
Yeah,
Agrippa is actually way more approachable than the Picatrix. There's a lot
yeah,
of that book is full of highly unusual and technical things.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't good enough at astrology yet
Mm.
to understand that with Picatrix. And like I said, the botanical names, that was just a mess. And I have no idea. I didn't want to even be responsible for that at the time. So I started Agrippa as an experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to see if I could do 5 chapters.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started realizing after doing 5 chapters that there was so much work to do with sources. Even though Campagne's critical edition has the bulk of that information, even going through all the sources that are mentioned there, it was just a huge rabbit hole that I realized really hadn't been, I wouldn't say hadn't been explored, but it wasn't well known yet.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't the first. Um,
Yeah, it's amazing. It's a testament to Agrippa's learning, right? That almost every single sentence is a reference to
mhm.
something. Like he's speaking classicism. He's really a profound Renaissance man, humanist kind of guy. And so it's
200 books,
no right. Yeah, I mean
200
he's
sources.
yeah. I mean Agrippa is incredibly well read, and part of what's interesting about him, right, is that he will just sort of drop hints that he knows that you know what he knows, um, as a kind of challenge to you. Like, do you really know what he knows? And it's really interesting to like you said, to try to trace down the rabbit hole of all the things that
Right.
he sort of drops hints of what he's doing.
And of course, if
Uh,
you could read that back then, you probably did know his sources.
Some people
There's a
did,
pretty good
yeah,
chance. It's a
yeah.
better chance than today for sure.
No, for sure, for sure. And I think that he was definitely writing for a very select audience. And I think that people like Ficino or Pico are the kind of people that he was reading.
Mhm.
Reuchlin and people like that. That's who he's leaning on. But how many people really knew that stuff? I mean,
Right.
that's a bigger question. And I guess that leads us to the next really big point, right? Like we have this JF, translation that occurred, and then we have the Tyson edition, right?
Mhm.
And no shame to the Tyson edition, right? Where it was an important part of trying to make Agrippa accessible to a generation of people. But what do you think really precipitated you to do this work of making this translation? What was the main thing that called at you to do this work?
Well, there are two things. First, all of the errors in both JF's translation and Tyson's notes, especially on astrology.
Mm,
It was a complete mess.
right.
To the extent that were not, if you do not know traditional astrology, traditional meaning, I'm just going to make up a date before the 18th century.
Sure.
Um, it would lead you in the wrong direction.
Hmm.
And the other issue is that Tyson's edition came out, I think, in '93,
That sounds right.
and a lot has happened in the world since then.
Hmm.
Um, Particularly the revival in traditional astrology. We have pretty much we have all of the major texts translated now, um, and equally so in the occult world. We have so much more sources available to us today, translations. Um, So Tyson, was pretty much working off of a lot of 19th century material, a lot of dictionaries. He had a copy of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos,
Hmm.
and an astrological dictionary from the 19th century, and that was pretty much it. So there's a lot of little astrological terms that are thrown in there that, unless you're an astrologer at the time, you would never pick it up.
Would you say that the major deficiencies of the JF translation and the Tyson version were astrological related deficiencies, or would you say that it's actually deeper than that?
It's
That
deeper.
there are deeper. Could you say more about what, in your experience, what are the deeper um, deficiencies of those translations? And again, I want to give Tyson his due, and also to,
Yeah.
be very honest about that. That scholarship moves forward, and we should honor scholarship that went before, and admit when scholarship needs to go forward.
Yeah, I want to. Yeah, that's one thing I'm trying to be very careful about. Is I don't want to badmouth Tyson or
Hmm.
JF, because it was very difficult what they did.
Right.
Um, but like I said, we have we have more available today. So the issues with the JF translation are partially astrological.
Hmm.
His philosophical material is pretty good.
Hmm.
Um, the animal, or the stones, animals, plants, that's sort of all over the place. There's some good ones. There's some crazy mistranslations. Tyson did pick up some of those.
Hmm.
But some, I mean, unless you read the Latin, there's no way. For instance, JF will translate hyena as civet cat, and that's not an obvious error unless
Right.
you look at the Latin. Um, you know, JF loved translating stones as jet. Pretty much any stone he could find was a jet.
Right.
Just things like that. There was an incense recipe where the Latin word was carabe, which is fairly obscure,
Right.
and JF translated that as carob.
Right. It's like a straight rendering. Yeah.
It's a straight rendering,
Yeah.
and a lot of other people did as well.
Right.
And after a lot of digging, I eventually figured out that it was a regional term for amber.
Right.
Things like that came up. But as far as the deficiencies for JF, it was mostly astrological and you know uh, botanical or biological names.
Right.
Um,
And also, I
but
think Agrippa leans really heavily on Pliny, and there's a lot of like the stuff
right.
in Pliny that's a mess.
Well,
Like
there's
no
just certain
one,
things we don't know.
yeah, like the
Yeah.
Pliny, like so much of what is coming from Agrippa is from Pliny, and Pliny references things that we. It's an honest question of whether even Agrippa knew what.
I don't think he did.
Yeah, I don't think he
Yeah.
did. Yeah, I
Right.
mean, I wanted you to say it before I said it, but yeah, sometimes I find when I read Agrippa in Latin, I see him quoting Pliny, and I'm like, I don't think you know what that is either, brother.
No, I don't
So,
think so. Um, Tyson, again, Tyson was working by hand. He didn't. There was no internet even really to speak of.
right.
I don't think there was internet actually.
At least not like outside of like AOL or
Right.
BBSs or something.
Yeah, AOL is questionable even.
Yeah.
93. Um, anyway, yeah, he was basically doing everything by hand. He did a pretty good job finding sources that he could identify.
Hmm.
They weren't always correct, but they make sense. I understand it. Um, I think he did a good job in attempting to correct the Hebrew. I don't know if he was really correct in doing so, but at least he knew that there was an issue there.
Right. Yeah. The Hebrew
Um,
is that's the big. Yeah.
Big
There's a lot of
contention.
deficiency. Yeah. The Hebrew is very very like corrupt and in the Agrippa, which is weird considering Agrippa had a lot of editorial power over
Mhm.
the printing, and yet like that's one of the areas that in some sense requires the most precision, and in some sense is the most corrupt.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
what's strange is where Agrippa sources Reuchlin,
Hmm.
um, the Hebrew is different
Yeah.
than the original, which I don't understand that because he had the
Yeah,
book right there.
I think it was a printing error.
Maybe.
I think that basically Agrippa turned over. I mean, he was a mobile dude, and I think he turned over the proof, and it went to the printer, and the printer guffed it. And then the subsequent, in subsequent editions, they try to fix it, and it gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, I
Which
learned
it
not to
always,
correct Agrippa.
Yeah.
So,
Which is always what happens with Hebrew. I mean, in Hebrew in like medieval or late, early modern occult sources, like the story is just a story of corruption. I mean, in the Monas Hieroglyphica, there's some Hebrew sections in there, and they gave them to Gershom Scholem, and Gershom Scholem was like, "I have no idea what this is."
Hmm.
I'm like, "Hey, look, dude, if Gershom Scholem can't figure out your Hebrew, good luck."
that's it.
Yeah, good luck.
um, but yeah, I just I think that reading Tyson, again, not to badmouth him, but it was just a mess. I mean, some of the astrology in there just does not make sense.
Yeah.
I'm even running a blank on some of it, but
And I
you know,
really appreciate, I want to say, I just really appreciate that because I'm not a person well versed in astrology. Like, I have to, it's one of my blind spots in my history and training in Western esotericism. And I remember like looking at like Usenet scans of the Latin of the three books way back in the 90s,
mhm,
and then looking at the the Tyson version in the early 90s as a kid, as a teenager, I mean, like, something's wrong here. Like,
mhm,
my high school Latin tells me something's up. Um, and I really appreciate the fact that you, as a person who really understands the astrology, is able to fix those things, um, because that's the kind of stuff that, in the astrological language is very technical. It's like a very
right.
small vocabulary, and I really appreciate the fact that you can like get those like 4 or 5 words and realize no, a mistranslation of those really misrepresents the entire system, because so much of Agrippa is about ascending
Mhm.
into the upper worlds, in which astrology is a key part of that. So how crucial that part is, and in terms of understanding him,
Well,
I can't really express enough how important that is to folks.
I mean, just a very easy example was, uh, Agrippa will mention, the terms, which is a five-fold division of each sign,
Mhm.
unequal division, and JF would translate it as marks,
Mm,
which, in all fairness, he probably couldn't think of a good English word for term. Um, I mean, William Lilly, which was roughly the same period, just used term.
right.
But he probably couldn't think of a good word. So he said marks. And then Tyson looked at it and says, oh, he's talking about the degrees of the zodiac.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yep. And so again, like, that's a it's not an error that's unforgivable or
mhm,
unreasonable. It's just
right.
an error that one would make it without that kind of erudition.
One of the things I've learned through this experience is, you know, having that kind of criticism for any well loved text really makes people kind of emotional.
No.
And it's
Yeah.
very interesting to me.
No, and this is the thing I get all the time where I criticize, translations, and people get really angry at me. I'm like, look, like, I can't really take responsibility for Robert Turner's, edition. The version you've read for the 10 years that you've been an occult practitioner, like, I'm sorry that Robert Turner did a bad job in the 17th century. I can't fix that. I can just tell you that he made mistakes.
Well, there
Um,
was one instance where one of the stones, I can't remember which one of the stars, I can't remember which one. Um, for years or I guess centuries, people have translated the stone as granite,
mhm.
and um, stone's actually garnet. And the Latin, just like English, it's only one letter
Yeah,
off.
it's one way. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was talking to an astrological magician, and I mentioned this to him, and he says, well, what am I supposed to do with all these talismans I've made with granite? And I'm like, I don't know. Does it still work? Maybe. I don't know. I'm just telling you what it
Yeah.
says. And
Yeah.
but then they doubled down like, oh no, it worked for me, so it's got to be granite. Actually,
Yeah. I
it's just it
mean,
is what it is.
yeah, it's one of those things where always I tell people I can't tell you how to do your practice. I can just tell you what the Latin says.
Right.
I can just tell you what the Hebrew says, what the Aramaic says.
And maybe they're
And
wrong. That could be, but
yeah, and if it works for you, great. But I all I can do is, like, for me as an academic, all I can do is say, this is what our texts say,
mhm.
and this is how I can be honest about it. just wanted to say, express a really deep thanks for a very strong supporter of the channel, and not just a supporter of the channel, but a supporter of esoteric content creation, both for my channel and for Angela Symposium, who I want to give a shout out for. Just thank you for this really impressive donation to the channel. I really appreciate that. Thanks, brother. I really appreciate it for making these kind of conversations possible, and supporting the work of making esoterica available on the internet. So really appreciate that. And also, just one more before we continue. Adrian, thank you so much. Hey, man, two great minds discussing Agrippa. This content is amazing. Very appreciative of you both. Thank you so much, Dr. Sledge, for this. Hey, Adrian, people like you make this work possible. And I just want to express my deep thanks for you for supporting these kind of conversations. Yeah. Again, this is the weird world we live in. We're back in the Renaissance, Eric. We're back in the days of like appealing to patrons and appealing to people who can support us. It's crowds. I'll call it crowdsourced esotericism. So we're back in the days.
Printing is we're back almost to the printing style too. You just pay a printer to print your book, and
it is a strange world we're back into. But again, just Baruch Hashem, thank you so much for folks who are making this possible through their donations. Eric, what was the most surprising thing when you were translating Agrippa? I have a couple things that I know of when I was reading him for the first time in Latin, but as a translator, you're really working close with this guy. What was one of the things that really what was something that really that struck you as a surprising moment translating him?
There's a few. I mean, source wise, I was surprised. Well, there were two surprises with sources. I was surprised that the depth of the quoting that he did, because it really does look like it's in his own words. He does such a good job piecing these quotes together that it's just absolutely seamless. And some paragraphs are, come from 5 books. That's amazing to me, and I can't imagine even writing a book that way. Not morally, but physically writing a book that way. But I also expected to see quotes from more grimoires or explicitly, occult books. There's basically none.
No, right, and
in the book,
and I think that's really important. And I'll piggyback on that. That's because Agrippa is a genuine Renaissance occultist. He's part of the Ficino Pico break with what they called the moderns. Like they hate like the Heptameron and all that stuff, which is ironic considering that's what Agrippa gets bound with later. But Ficino especially, and Pico and Reuchlin, they deeply hate the grimoire tradition. They find it to be deeply they really hate it. They think it's a fundamental corruption of everything.
Right.
And I think that the lack of quotations is completely on purpose.
I'm sure it is. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Agrippa
was a surprise though.
Yeah, it's a surprise because we think of him as being the occult philosopher, therefore he would do occult stuff. But we don't think of him as a Renaissance philosopher who's breaking with what he takes to be a medieval corruption of everything. So we would think of him as being part of, the Heptameron and the Key of Solomon and all this stuff. And when he gets shown, he's shown with all those texts, but he would have hated that. He would
I also point out to people that the very definition of occult is not really what people think it is today.
Right. No.
And I know you know this, but
of course, hidden forces.
And I always, the joke I've always made is it's kind of like that Agrippa is sort of a hidden juggalo because it's magnets. How do they work? It was throughout a occult force. It was a hidden force. Not necessarily demonic. In fact, he even says that in a few places that things can work from a hidden power that ignorant people will mistake as, something sinister, demonic or whatever. And so I think people sometimes come into reading this book expecting, the goth magic,
Mm.
when in reality it's essentially it's a book on, I don't know, Renaissance physics,
Yeah,
in a lot of ways.
right. Especially the first book. I mean,
Yes,
yeah,
especially the
yeah,
first book.
especially the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah, and I think that's a thing that people often also how Christian it is. I think that's the other thing that people like find if you read it, you're like, oh yeah, this guy's a Christian. He's a weird
He's a
Christian.
true believer though.
Yeah, but he's an absolute Christian, and
Yeah.
he really does. He really believes that he's returning Christianity, a type of Christianity, to its rightful place.
Well, and also that's one of the main points of the book is to define what good magic is, which,
Mhm.
as you know, is a central theme to so many esoteric
Right.
writings from the beginning of writing. Um, but he's trying to be, because sometimes, I think in his opinion, Ficino could have been murky a little bit,
Right.
whereas Agrippa was really trying to be, to precisely define what good magic is, what bad
Right.
magic is, why maybe the Christian fathers may have actually done some magic.
Right.
Um,
And this is why I tend to want to call the three books the Summa Magica. Like I tend to refer to them like if we think about the Summa Theologica as the chief text of theology of the Middle Ages, the three books is the Summa Magica. It's the chief text of systematization of magic in the the Renaissance or whatever. And so, yeah, he's providing he's providing a rigorous system of magic and how it works, um, over and against the ideas of I think the workings of the moderns, right? The
mhm.
Grimoire tradition. So just a short question in the super chat. So this is from Sierra Corrigan. So Eric, any thoughts on why Cliff Lowe uses blue sapphire instead of yellow sapphire for solar talismans?
That gets very complicated. I had some discussions about this with him. So the ancient uh, terms for, well, anything, but stones in this example, were not necessarily the same as ours.
Mhm.
And from what I could figure out, it could be wrong. Um, that so in Agrippa they mention yellow sapphire and blue sapphire, and sometimes they don't specify. Um, from what I could tell, blue sapphire is what we would call sapphire, and yellow sapphire is what we would call topaz.
Mhm.
And but sometimes Agrippa just says sapphire, and I don't remember in the Sun, but he must just say sapphire. So I think that it's easy to look at that and assume that he just means the blue sapphire. So I think it's a little bit confusing exactly what Agrippa would have meant. Um, I mean, I think that there's an argument to be made that he might mean topaz
Right. I mean the
today.
color, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think
Right.
that's his reasoning, is that it says sapphire on it. So,
Right.
yeah.
Right. Sierra, I hope that helps to clarify things. Um, Eric,
Oh, by the
what?
way, I was saying she asked if both could be used. I just saw that.
Yeah.
Try it. Honestly, I think that a lot of times these attributions they describe things as a clear stone or a stone that is bright and things like that. Blue sapphire could probably be used, according to those definitions. I think the sun is bright and clear stones, if I'm not mistaken. So yes, it could be used in that sense, but I'm not going to be authoritative on that. So
There we go. Major misconceptions, Eric. Like, what do you think are some of the misconceptions when people think of Agrippa's three books of occult philosophy? What would be a couple of misconceptions? Like when I think of people mistaking, they think of occult means like the devil or
right,
Satanism, or which couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like clearly, what he means is hidden. It's hidden forces in the world.
right.
But aside from that very obvious uh, misconception of Agrippa. What are some misconceptions you get about Agrippa, maybe in the world of folks who practice occultism, or folks for whom this is a part of their spiritual practice?
Um, I think the biggest issue is people dismiss him right away.
Mm,
A lot of times people are looking for recipes, so they want to know how to do the ceremony. Agrippa doesn't tell you that. Also, people think that his material is, I mean, I guess everything's incomplete in some way, but briefer than it really is. The chapter headings are misleading, and so people often
yeah.
use it as a reference book.
Yep. I
So if you
often
look at
I
it, oh, go ahead.
often sometimes call it the occult coffee table book. That people have it
Right.
as like they have the Tyson version on their coffee table, and it's the occult coffee table book, and no one reads it, but they flip through it and look through all the weird pictures, or all the weird woodcuts or whatever. And I tell people, like, it is not a coffee table book. It is, you cannot flip through this. It's a systematic text.
Yep.
So
And the comparison I always give, I like food, so um, the comparison I make is, in some cookbooks they'll like Julia Child has a section in her book on the mother sauces,
hmm,
and that's one section. And then later on, 200 pages later, they'll have some beef recipe, and she'll say, "Okay, well, put in this sauce," and there's no recipe for that sauce, and you have to look elsewhere. Agrippa would have expected you to read the book and
mhm,
to understand the information. He builds on the information brick by brick, layer by layer. So, there'll be a chapter on astrological correspondences in their own chapter, but later on in book 2 or book 3, that material comes up again in a
right.
different way. So you're missing a huge chunk of information just by looking at the chapters themselves.
Yeah, this is a thing I've said, that I wish there were a version of the 3 books that had no illustrations, because then people would be forced to read it, right?
Well, the original Latin has very few
Right,
by
right,
comparison.
right, by comparison. The
Yeah.
Tyson has too many. I think
Yeah.
it's that, and I really do feel like if people could not use it as a coffee table book and people had to read it cover to cover, it would be a totally different experience, because it is a
Yes.
systematic text. That Agrippa is a systematic thinker. It is not a. I even hear people, even today, people say things. Oh, it's an encyclopedia. I'm like, what are you
No,
talking about?
it is not.
It, like, the only person who would say it's an encyclopedia is anyone who's never read it. It's a systematic theory and practice of magic. That, and I think what you say is really, really interesting, is that it doesn't tell you how to do anything, and
But it
like,
tells you why.
it tells you why, and I think that's
Mhm.
so interesting. And maybe we can come back to that in a minute. Like, what to do in the absence of the how. I think that's a fascinating question. Maybe we can come back to it in a
Yeah.
minute.
Okay.
Like, we have the theory, but we don't have the how, and like what to think about the question of the how. And I guess this is a question that I really would love to ask you. And it's a question and again, I think the best questions we can always ask are the questions that we would have asked ourselves when we first encountered Agrippa.
Mhm.
And I think that question is, how do you read this thing? Like, Eric, I mean, let's reach back to our young selves, right? Like, our young occulty selves. We're finding Agrippa for the first time, and it's just really lucky, right? Because theoretically, young occultists can be finding your text, in
Mhm.
a way that, in my opinion, is much more reliable than previous texts. How can we encourage, what is the advice you would give to someone as a young person interested in the occult, or a young person interested in occultism? What's your advice to for folks wanting to approach this text for the first time?
I mean, there's no trick to it. That's the problem.
Mhm.
You know,
It's hard. It's a daunting text. We
it's
should
a
be
daunting
very.
text.
Yeah,
You start with the head and end with the tail.
yeah.
um, I For me, the motivation is what the book can give you. That because so whenever I'm taught how to do something in magic, the first question I have to my teachers is, what do you do if you get the absolute worst scenario?
Mhm.
And you cannot understand that unless you know why you're doing it to begin with. Because when you're doing magic, it almost never works out the way it's in the book. And unless you know why you're doing it, you don't have the mental, well, I shouldn't say you don't. It's less likely you're going to have the mental wherewithal to work around that and to make the substitutions intelligently, or to fix the problem intelligently. And I think anybody who's serious in doing traditional Western magic needs to read this book. I mean, it's like
Mm.
reading. Well, we're using food again. It's just like reading a cookbook and doing exactly what they're saying in the cookbook all the time, and not ever realizing why you're doing it.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I give the example. It's like being Catholic and not really getting under, not really studying Thomas, right?
right,
Like if you're gonna be a real Catholic and do Catholicism, if you're gonna be a Jew and really do Judaism, like you got to do. I mean, these are the texts,
right.
and I agree. Agrippa is he's a mountain, but he's a
It's
mountain.
a mountain, but it's not. It's a large mountain, but you can climb it.
You can
I
climb
mean,
it.
it's not. The first time I read it was straight through because I'm weird that way.
Yeah.
But you could do it. It was the Tyson edition too, so it wasn't
Right.
mine.
Right.
um, so yeah, there was I had to do a lot of mental translations.
Mhm.
But it's doable, but you just have to have the the wherewithal to do it. Um, I just think if you want to deepen your knowledge, it's the place to go. I mean, there's other books on theory. I mean, you have Ficino, for
Yep.
instance, but Ficino isn't quite as comprehensive as Agrippa is.
Right, and also I think Ficino has a very particular axe to grind. Like he's really
Right.
trying to reconcile Christianity and Platonism, but as opposed to there's no Kabbalah in Ficino,
No, I do
right?
love
And
Platonic theology, though.
yeah, yeah, and so I think that what really, and this is why I really consider Agrippa to be the first real occultist, is that he's bringing in not only Platonism but Hermeticism and Kabbalah,
Right.
and that to me is the foundation. It's Platonism, you know, occult Christianity, Kabbalah. Those are the kind of things, and I think this is why Agrippa is the foundation. So
He's sort of a greatest hits in a lot of ways. Because there are some books in there that I sourced. One of them is Georgie's Harmonia Mundi,
mhm.
and I was looking at this and I'm thinking, this would be really interesting to translate. It's physically larger than 3 books is. But then I realized that no one's going to really want to read it. But it is Agrippa took the best parts of it.
Right, right.
You know,
Yeah. So yeah, Miss Diana, thank you. I owe you an email actually, Deanna. So we'll look for that soon. But thank you so much for this super chat, and owe you an email soon. And also, Fretch RC, Eric, your translation reads like a hot knife through butter. So satisfying. uh, yeah, thank you guys for heaping praise on Eric, having done this enormously important task. Um, yeah, I don't know, Eric. I don't know how available you would be or how open you would be, but I think a class I would love to do, and I'm just pitching this now and no commitment at all. But it'd be so amazing to do a joint class with you and some other folks on Agrippa, just to
I've been
teach,
thinking about that actually.
just like
Yeah.
me and you and some other folks that I know, just to do a online session, just like a semester long ongoing class on Agrippa's 3 books. I think that would be, you know,
That I've literally been thinking about that. To kind of go back a little bit to your last question in the introduction, I summarized the chapters in groups, um, which is really how the book is really laid out.
mhm,
So if you want to read about the planets, you read X number of chapters. If you want to read about the elements, it's these 6 chapters or whatever they are.
yeah,
Um, as opposed to chapter by chapter. If you're going to take a shortcut, read you know the subject matter, the groups of chapters um, that comprise that subject matter.
right. I think again, it's kicking, but punting a ball, right? Like doing a punt. Like maybe I would say that if we were to do a real semester long deep dive into Agrippa's occult philosophy, I think it would be a great service. And
I
also
agree. Yeah.
not necessarily not just a great service, but also a testament to why people should be reading your translation and a celebration of your translation to really honor your translation by doing a deep dive into it
Hmm.
and really working through it. So
Yeah, we'll talk about it. I
yeah,
I've been thinking about some class, and I wasn't sure how to approach it. So
let's chat about it. I'd
yeah,
love if Esoterica could be a platform for doing that. I would be deeply honored
that'd be
for
cool.
that possibility. So let's talk about Agrippa's Latin, right? Agrippa's infamous for his Latin, right? Famously, as a teenager, he would only talk to people in Latin, and he was like, he was sort of a
Nerd.
jackass, right? He was an absolute Latin nerd, right? He would talk to people in Latin. He would only let people talk to him in Latin. Um, any comments on his Latin, on his Latinity, right? Like him as a Latinist, but also this is a question I get a lot. A lot of folks want to learn Latin, and I totally get it, right? Like Latin is such a huge part of Western esotericism. So much is written in Latin,
Hmm.
again, when I pick up show off my this my 1600 version of the text, right? Like people want to learn Latin, right? Like they want to learn to read this stuff. Um,
I want to learn Arabic.
yeah, yeah, I want yeah, I want to learn Middle Chinese. Um, uh, what is your tips for folks who want to get their Latin better, who want to pick up some of Agrippa's Latinity? Like, what are your tips on as a translator, who's someone who's done the work? Like, what is your tips on someone who doesn't have access to like university Latin or whatever, like
Right.
who just wants to like deepen their Latin because they want to deepen their access to these texts, but also want
Hmm.
to deepen their access to these texts in their practice.
Well, the hard part's the grammar,
Mhm. Isn't it all?
and and um, I struggle with that quite a bit. I still do sometimes. Um, I, I started out with Wheelock's Latin and
Yep.
dictionaries, and what my test to myself was, because he was quoting so many things, I could do things like compare what I was translating versus Virgil, other translations, like comparing myself with Fagles or somebody like that.
Mm.
Um, uh, and that's a good way to get started because you can sort of check yourself.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, yeah, that's probably the best thing to do. I mean, I think when most people want to use Latin, I think you're thinking of probably shorter sections anyway, unless you want to do a whole book. But most people want to have those prayers in Latin,
Right.
for a ceremony or something, and that's extremely doable. Um,
Yeah, that's really easy Latin, all things told.
yeah, and Google translates a mess with that.
Yeah, this is the thing I'll also say.
Yeah,
Never put anything in Latin in Google Translate.
no,
Ever. Like, don't do it. Like you will get gibberish.
yeah,
Um,
it actually even takes out words sometimes too. So
yeah, yeah. So I mean, it's funny, like Willocks, like I grew up on Willock and some other stuff, and I will say that again, I will tell people you can get Willock's Latin on Amazon for
mhm.
cheap. Work through the whole book in a semester.
They have
Just do it.
flashcards even.
Yeah, do it in a semester every
Yeah.
day, 30 minutes a day, and you will get in a position where you can read Latin relatively well. I mean, not perfectly, but medieval
Mhm.
Latin, like you'll be in a good shape.
Yeah, with Agrippa, it's interesting because he's quoting so many different people. He has, he'll have one paragraph that might be quoting Ficino in one part and then Apuleius in another part,
Yeah,
and that's a vast difference in
yeah,
styles. And to a native, I don't know. I always wondered what someone who is was conversational as he was, what that would have felt like to him. So it was probably less jarring for me. The verse was hard
Yeah.
to do, and I didn't even try to make it poetic at all, because there's, especially something like Virgil. I'm not going to compete with Fagles,
Yeah. No.
and if you want to read beauty, read that.
Mhm.
But JF's translations are very difficult to understand, and I in a lot of cases, it sort of his floweriness. I guess it's a word. Overshadows the utility of the text itself.
Yep.
And so I just tried to simplify it. This is what the line says, you
Yep.
know. Um,
Let me put this in the chat so folks have it. Locks, Latin. There you go, folks.
I haven't tried Duolingo yet. I'm curious what that's like.
Yeah, I don't
Probably
know.
pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, maybe good for speaking a language, but yeah, like,
I can't imagine
uh,
because it's too. Yeah.
yeah, it's so much about the. Yeah, I think that Latin's all about translating. That's how you do it. It's like the rote, brutal, like, and translating
Mhm.
different eras. Like, again, Latin's a 3,000 old language. You have to really work through. Like, Seneca is very different than Ficino, and you have to sort that out.
Ficino's like butter, though.
Yeah, Ficino's like, I will say that.
I like Ficino.
Yeah, when I have to read, yeah, Ficino's really nice, and it's funny because, Dana Trail and I are good friends, and we talk a lot about reading Ficino and reading other stuff in Latin, and yeah, it's funny like what our Latinity is, in terms of like what we like to read or whatever. Um, Eric, how did translating Agrippa affect your practice? And one of the really cool things about this channel is I get to talk to folks who are scholars
Mhm.
and practitioners, and you're clearly an example of both of those people. um and I really appreciate the fact that you are both of those.
Mhm.
And to what degree did this project, this massive project of translating Agrippa, how did it affect your practice or worldview or any of that? And could you say some more about that?
Yeah. So I have a strange, uh, I don't know, double life with magic.
Yeah.
I clearly love books. I love books, and um, but on the other hand, my practice is mostly Afro-Cuban,
Mhm.
which is notoriously non-book based. In fact, it's fairly hostile to books. It's mostly oral. So so magically, I tend, I have to kind of do what I was taught, what I've seen. But how what Agrippa wrote, though, I think is more universal than it appears on paper, because he clearly was not talking about anything I'm doing. Um, but I think that to some extent, spirits are spirits. The way you interact with them. I think that if nothing else, um, you can learn how to make the right inquiries,
Mhm.
and that's where it really helped me personally. Was it sort of taught me how to be, um, how to think as a spiritual person. When you
Mhm.
read Agrippa, you're immersing yourself into a different worldview than we have in the 21st century.
Yeah, for sure.
And, to put, I guess, to immerse yourself in a world that's entirely spiritual, that believes in spirits and astrology unquestioningly. Um, Whereas today it's easy to sort of second guess yourself, that, okay, it's your mind or whatever. And, you know, in my Afro-Cuban practice, we have this sort of, we have a visceral experience of spirit. It's very much there.
Mhm.
But then to read it sort of intellectual version of that was interesting to me.
Mm.
Um, I don't know. I would like to see people thinking more along those lines. Just it isn't that they're going to find the answers there necessarily, but to sort of think about why they're doing what they're doing. I mean, it's what the people did back then. They had a lot of time to think. So it definitely helped me. I think intellectualize what I was doing in a profound way. I mean, I think about Agrippa every day. So
It's fascinating. It's really fascinating also as a person who that's not your personal spiritual path, and yet you really did this amazing work to make it available.
Well, the astrology is. I mean,
Right.
I do
Okay.
astrology actively.
Well, of course, yeah.
That's definitely there. But I'm not a Western ceremonial magician,
Right.
really. So I'm interested in it intellectually, but not in my practice.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful answer, because in the same way that I'm also not a practitioner, and yet this is my wheelhouse, and I really want to be I want to be as I want to make this stuff as accessible as possible.
Mhm.
So I appreciate that that impulse. Um, Eric, how do you think this stuff can? How do you think that your translation of Agrippa can be impactful in ceremonial magic? In a way that maybe you're not directly involved in, but how do you think that this? How would you like to see your project taken up? Like, how would you like to? What impact would you like it? Would you like it to see?
Well, so my approach to the book was so Tyson's approach was that he wanted to footnote every detail as much as he could, so that he could explain everything to the best of his ability to a modern audience. My approach was I wanted to get it out there in the best way possible. And so I think from a scholarly level, I would like that to be the beginning of something, like a beginning of research. From a practitioner standpoint, I would like to see this being part of. I mean, it's already happening. There's already a lot of people who are taking a more critical and intellectual approach to the magic they do. We have so many good sources available today. Stephen Skinner, people like him, that we now have. We can now take a more rounded approach to the magic itself, as opposed to we have this one book. This is all we have, and we're going to do the best we can with it. Now we can actually look at Solomonic magic, for instance, and instead of having one book, we now have a dozen, and we can modify the approach accordingly. And this is the intellectual arm of all of that. This book is. So I would like to see people dig into that a little bit more, because it's one thing to do, and I've said, we've already talked about this, but it's one thing just to do something, but it's quite another to understand why you're doing it and the importance of that thing. Elements, as an example, people give lip service to the elements all the time. And his chapter on the elements is one of the best I've seen anywhere. It's beautiful to read.
It is. Yeah.
But the descriptions he has make sense, and it shows what the elements really are. They're qualitative. And so it's not just some superstitious, oh, you got fire in me, type of approach.
Yeah.
That's kind of quaint. They used to believe that, so I'll just use it in this ritual. There's more to it than that. So I would hope that this kind of opens up that approach a little bit more in people.
So what's your elevator pitch for someone to work through the 3 books? Like, imagine sorry. But yeah, what's your like, I love the 3 books. I read them like they're, they're part of my world. But for like the young people, like the TikTok witch, like people trying to really intellectually embrace this tradition, which again, I'm not a practitioner, and yet I want people to read Agrippa because I think he's such a genius.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so happy. I'm really just so thrilled that they have access to him through a translation like yours. What's your elevator pitch for read Agrippa? Give him a chance. Work through it. It's hard.
It is hard.
It's hard. It's worth it. It's the mountain of esotericism, but it's hard, but
We've been sort of dancing around the subject, actually. I mean, I don't know. This isn't much of a pitch. The way my mind works is I like to find out where something comes from,
Mhm.
and I guess now we know where Agrippa comes from too. But it's to me, it's not enough just to sit there and buy some occult book off the shelf and just take that as gospel. And I don't know. I mean, to me, the motivation to read Agrippa is so that you can understand what you're doing. I mean, as opposed to, it's, I guess people have a lot of different, this is a horrible pitch. A lot of people have different reasons for why they practice magic. And sometimes it's, to get money, to get laid. Sometimes it's knowledge. Sometimes the knowledge comes from those things. And I don't think that, I think that if you're just doing the recipes, you're only getting one side of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to have that complete picture of what you're doing in a magical context, then yes, you have to read Agrippa because that's the meat of it. That's the actual meat of it. It's not the icing. Well, meat and icing don't go together. It's not the gravy. But there was something I was going to say about that too. Something profound that I forgot. Come back to it.
I guess what I would say is that
You'll probably do better than I will.
No idea. I'm in Detroit. Tell you the car example. I would say that if you drive a car, right, and a car is a way that if a car is a thing you rely upon, right,
Mhm.
right, if a car, no matter what car you have, a Tesla or a Chrysler or a Ford or a Honda, they all rely on some basic structural things,
Mhm.
right? They all, no matter what car you rely on, Thelema, Wicca, modern witchcraft, whatever,
Mhm.
all of them operate on the engine of Agrippa.
Mm.
Agrippa is the engine. I don't care what Western esotericism, trend, chaos magic, whatever. You can pick whatever system you want that's Western, right? Afro-Cuban occultism and other stuff. That's a different thing, right?
Mhm.
But if you're doing something Western esotericism, no matter Enochian magic, no matter how broadly construed, the car you're driving is Agrippa.
This is the roots.
Learn your Agrippa. No matter what system you use, Thelema, Enochian magic, chaos magic, whatever. Academics. If you're
Mhm.
studying magic academically, you cannot understand magic academically without understanding this text, because every single thing after this text flows from it.
And there was nothing like it before it was written. That's
Yeah.
the. I mean, that's what's interesting is people sometimes dismiss it because it's fairly late, in the tradition.
It's not
And
fairly. I would say it's fairly early, actually.
or
It's
fairly early.
amazing.
No, but I'm thinking compared to it's 16th century as opposed to medieval or something like that.
Yeah,
Because a lot
but
of people
again,
want to gravitate to the older things.
right. But again,
Yeah,
it's a rejection of those things too,
it is.
right? Yeah. So if you want to do Grimoire magic, fine, but just know that Agrippa's not on your team,
Right. But he can still make you
which is
understand it
shocking.
better.
Which is shocking, right? Because if you want to do Grimoire, people think that they want to do Grimoire magic and then play ball with Agrippa, and Agrippa would never play ball with you.
But he
Like,
was more about astrological magic and alchemy and things like that.
Yeah. And Agrippa's student, Johann Weyer, his mockery of necromancy gave rise to the lesser Goetia, like the Goetia.
Right.
Like that is the hilariousness of all this, right? Like the one text that everyone knows now, the Goetia, was born out of a mockery of a text of a student of Agrippa.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine that the one text that most occultists know, the Goetia, popularized by Aleister Crowley, was a mockery of a text by a student of Agrippa?
Out of context.
Homework, folks. And I'm not saying the Goetia is bad or whatever.
No, of course not.
I'm saying homework. We are not living in the shadow of Aleister Crowley. We're not living in the shadow of McGurr Mathers. We have
Blavatsky, for that matter.
Or Blavatsky, God forbid. Yeah. We have so much access to scholarship. Let's take
it's so available because I mentioned Skinner earlier. I mean, he's a great example of it.
No,
He just turns out.
Yeah, he's just amazing.
David Rankin, all these people.
Eric, thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, again, man, one of my favorite things to do in my life is in Hebrew we call it kol hakavod, like all the praise, like all the glory. And when we say kol hakavod in Hebrew, it means like you really have done something. And I'm not heaping praise for no reason. You've made a text that I think is the most accessible and the most important text in Western esotericism, accessible to people, in a way that's not been really accessible in hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. And I did it sort of blindly too. I wasn't really thinking like, oh, no one's going to want to buy this or whatever. Because the like I said earlier, I did it sort of like in little chunks.
Yeah.
Just as an experiment, and it just sort of ballooned from there.
I appreciate it, and I think many other people appreciate it. So, Eric, where can folks find you? Where can folks get in touch with you? Where can folks find? I have your copy signed. I really was really happy to be able to buy a copy signed. I really want to encourage folks. Please, 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 if you want to buy a copy of Eric's really important translation, buy it from him as directly as you can. Get a signed translation.
Mm-hmm.
The money goes to him. And again, I'm not here to talk about money because I'm trying to be like a money grubbing person or whatever. Eric and other people who do translation work and do this kind of work are not making $1 million.
Nope.
No, they're doing this work out of a labor of intense love. And when you can buy their text directly from them and get them signed by the author, they get a chunk of that. They get a bigger chunk of that than Amazon or whatever. Eric, where can we get where can someone get a copy of your wonderful translation of Agrippa signed by you? Where can they get that? Where can they reach you?
I have a website, which is very difficult to remember. It is ericpurdue.com.
ericpurdue.com.
Yep.
I'm going to put that in the description.
It's PUR, not PER, like the chicken.
So, folks, I really encourage you, go to Eric's website, get a copy of his translation of Agrippa, get it signed, study it. And I think, again, for folks who are academics who want to study esotericism, you will be better off. Mm-hmm. And for folks who are practitioners of Western esotericism, you'll be better off too, because you have a deeper understanding of the intellectual and astrological structures, of which, again, Agrippa was an astute astrologer. And when Eric talks about the fact that these translations get astrology wrong, if you care about astrology, which I can't imagine any modern esotericism not caring about that, like you just can't.
Tyson's a mess with that.
Right.
Yeah.
Look, folks, and again, I'm not here to like diss on people's trying to work. Eric's not here to discount people's work. Tyson did incredible work in his time.
Mhm.
He worked his ass off to do that work.
I can't even imagine, to be honest with you.
Yeah. We're again, I'm honoring that work and also saying I think that Tyson would say the work goes forward because the work
Mhm.
always goes forward.
Mhm.
So
There'll be more
um
after me.
yeah, and after me, God, with God's help. So um Eric, I just want to extend a real thanks for the work you've done and
Oh, thank
for
you.
joining me tonight on Esoterica. And yeah, thank you, brother.
Thanks. Well, I'm glad to be here.
All right, folks. Well, we're gonna wrap it up, and I'll see you Friday. We're doing a whole deep dive on the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which is I think is a super important gospel. And aside from that, um, look forward to some spooky stuff. I'm doing a whole episode on, I think, the most important document about the images of demonology in the entire Western world, and that is Molitor's De Lamiimis, book in the 15th century, an incurable work. I would argue that Da Lamiimis of Molitor is probably the most important demonological work ever published, despite the fact that something like Malleus Maleficarum is probably the most influential.
Mhm.
I would say that Molitor's work actually had a deeper impact in the long run. So, so come Friday for the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and then next week, spooky stuff. We're going to look at probably the most important secular text on demonology, that is also important because it probably contains the most important images of demonology in all of Western civilization. So come join us for that, and then after that, I don't know, more spooky
Something.
stuff. Spooky stuff. So I hope you'll join me there. So, any rate, Eric, thank you so much for joining me. And
Thanks for having me.
yeah, so folks, get Eric's copy of Agrippa, and if you can, support Esoterica on Patreon, or the one-time donation, or the super thanks. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate it.